In today's video, we'll be examining a haunting unsolved mystery with two plausible suspects, a mystery from a small town with only a dozen residents, and a murder that changed a small town forever. But before we get to that, I want to bring you a word from our sponsor, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new documentary streaming service, and I'm obsessed with it. If you like documentaries, you'll love Magellan TV as well. They have a great selection of crime and mystery documentaries, and one of the best ones is Jack the Ripper, The Definitive Story. It uses actors in 3D virtual environments to take a factual look at one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. Another recommendation I have is a series called Crimes That Made History. They are 25-minute documentaries about some of the most well-known and bizarre crimes in history, like the Jonestown Massacre and the death of Princess Diana. Crime and mystery documentaries are only just one genre that Magellan TV offers. It was created by filmmakers, and they have amassed thousands of documentary movies, series, and playlists in genres like war and military, nature, and culture. And new documentaries are added weekly. The videos have no interruptions, and they are ad-free. Also, many of the documentaries are available in 4K. Magellan TV is a great way to learn more and get insight into topics that you're already passionate about. And it's easy to access Magellan TV. It's available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, Google Play, and iOS, or simply cast from your phone to your TV. If you want to check out Magellan TV for yourself, go to magellantv.com/criminallylisted and you'll get a month for free. So please help support Criminally Listed and get access to thousands of great documentaries by checking out Magellan TV. Number 3. Dorothy Thompson. In June 1965, Dorothy Thompson was 30 years old. She lived with her husband, 32-year-old Arvin Thompson, their 2-year-old daughter, Krista, and her 64-year-old mother-in-law, Agnes. They lived in the small town of Barkhamsted, Connecticut, which had a population of around 1,700 people. Before Dorothy married Arvin, she worked as a teller at the bank in town. Arvin worked as an accountant, and on the weekends, he did renovations on their home. On June 15, 1965, Arvin went to work. When he came home at around 6:15 p.m., he found his wife lying on the ground in the backyard near their sun porch. It was clear she had been brutally murdered. As Arvin ran to the neighbors to get help, he screamed that his wife was dead and he couldn't find the baby. His neighbor went over to the house. He looked in the 5 rooms on the main floor. 3 of them were splattered with blood. There was a large pool of blood in the kitchen. The neighbor made his way upstairs. The upstairs had been converted into an apartment for Arvin's mother, Agnes. The neighbor opened the door to one of the bedrooms, and he found Agnes and Krista. They were unharmed. The police were called, and they concluded that Dorothy was attacked in the kitchen while she was ironing her husband's shirt. She tried to run away, and this is how the blood got into the other rooms. Her body was then dragged outside to the sun deck. An electrical cord from a toaster was wrapped around her neck, and then the other end was tied around a nail. The killer was trying to hang her, but the nail wasn't strong enough, and she fell 10 feet to the ground below. The police believe that Dorothy knew her killer because there were not many defensive wounds. Only one thing was missing from the home, and that was a piggy bank with about $20 worth of coins inside of it. Behind the house, the police found a bloody rock and a small sledgehammer that was covered in blood. The coroner determined what was evident from looking at Dorothy, the 30-year-old wife and mother, had died a brutal death. He theorized that she was first stabbed with a dinner fork. When that became bent, he stabbed her with a large carving fork. She was then beaten about the head with a small sledgehammer. Also, a 19-pound rock had been slammed into her abdomen. She was then dragged down to the sun porch where the killer attempted to hang her. She probably hung there for a few minutes and then fell to the ground. The coroner could not determine the exact cause of death. He said that any of the sets of injuries could have killed her. The coroner thought that Dorothy was killed sometime around noon. A police officer who had dated Dorothy before she married Arfin passed by her house at about 1:30 on the afternoon that she was killed. He saw a black 1959 Ford in the driveway. He specifically remembered the car because 2 weeks earlier, a man driving a black 1959 Ford was wanted for exposing himself at a nearby reservoir. The officer noted that the driver of the car was a young man with blonde hair. He was about 5'10" or 5'11" and possibly weighed 200 pounds. He was wearing glasses and he had a pink shirt and gray pants on. The officer did not think he was the man they were looking for, so he drove on without writing down the license plate. 3 days after the murder, Arfin got a strange letter in the mail. It was handwritten in black ink. The postmark was June 17th, which was 2 days after the murder. It reads, "I liked your wife. She worked with me at the bank. I told her if I couldn't have her, no one would. She didn't believe me. It took a long time, but I succeeded in what I planned. Soon I will kill the baby, so no sign of her will remain in my mind. I stabbed her with a fork. I stomped on her face, then I dragged her through the house with an electrical cord. Then I used a hammer to pound in the shike to hang her. She fell to the ground, and then I bashed her head in several times with a large rock. I used a neighbor's car, a dark blue 58 Ford hardtop. I wanted to take her with me away from here, but she wouldn't go. My car was too old and ran too poorly, so I stole someone's on the way to her house. Pretty smooth, except she wouldn't go with me. I'll kill the baby someday soon. I'll kill the baby too, and my wife." The letter was unsigned. Arfin handed the letter over to the police. The lead detective on the case, Major Samuel Rome, read the letter. He did not believe it was from the killer. Rome thought that the writer could have gotten all the details that were mentioned in the letter from newspaper articles about the murder. But Arfin did not think that was true. The postmark of the letter was June 17th, 2 days after the murder. None of the articles published on or before June 17th mentioned a rock being used in the murder. Nevertheless, Rome still did not think that the killer wrote the letter. Rome had a suspect in the case, and it was Dorothy's mother-in-law, Agnes. Agnes was home during the murder, and she claimed she was upstairs all afternoon with her granddaughter. She said she heard some thumps and saw a large dark car in the driveway, but that was it. Rome thought it would have been impossible for Agnes not to hear more than a few thumps during such a brutal murder. Also, the relationship between Dorothy and Agnes was not good. Supposedly, Agnes had schizophrenia and Dorothy was afraid of her. Rome theorized that on the day of the murder, Agnes became angry with Dorothy. She attacked Dorothy and then saw what she did, so she decided to finish the job. Other detectives who worked on the case did not believe that Agnes was the killer. They thought she was too old and too weak to have committed such a brutal attack. For example, it's believed that Dorothy was dragged out of the house and onto the sun porch. Both Dorothy and Agnes weighed about 115 pounds. Would a 64-year-old woman been able to drag a body that weighed as much as she did out of the house and onto the sun porch? Also, would she have been able to lift the 19-pound rock to drop on Dorothy's abdomen? Another problem with the theory of Agnes being the killer is what did she do with the missing piggy bank? The murder weapons were all found in and around the home, so where was the piggy bank? Also, none of the murder weapons had Agnes's fingerprints on them. Would she have had the mindset to cover up her tracks like that? Finally, Agnes's apartment was searched and nothing incriminating was found. The day after the murder, Agnes was hospitalized. Major Rome tried to question Agnes, but her responses were not coherent. The coroner held an inquest in October 1965, about 4 months after the murder. The result of the inquest was that Agnes was found criminally responsible for Dorothy's murder. A warrant was issued for her arrest, but was never served because she was already confined to a hospital. 6 months after the murder, some children were playing at their grandparents' home, which was about 2.5 miles from the crime scene. They found an empty piggy bank. The grandparents knew that a piggy bank was the only item missing from the Thompsons' home, so they called the police. Arfin identified the piggy bank as the one stolen from their home. Not long after the discovery of the piggy bank was made public, a man called the police. He said that a week after the murder, he saw what he thought was a 1959 black Chevy parked in the area where the piggy bank was found. When the man pulled up behind the car took off. The discovery of the piggy bank made it clear to most of the detectives that Agnes did not commit the murder. It's believed that the piggy bank was stolen to make the murder look like a robbery gone wrong. Would an elderly schizophrenic woman have the mindset to stage the robbery and then dump the piggy bank 2.5 miles from the crime scene? Also, Agnes did not own a car or drive. So did she walk the 5-mile round trip to dump the piggy bank? The detectives did not think it would make sense that Agnes would have done that. Also, a young man with blonde hair driving a dark car was seen at the Thompsons' home around the time of the murder. The police even found evidence that a car had been at the Thompsons' house that afternoon. They found fresh tire tracks in the driveway. The tracks looked like someone had left in a hurry. Finally, a black car was seen in the area where the piggy bank was dumped. The detectives reasoned it would have made more sense that the young man was the killer. But Major Rome still considered Agnes to be the only viable suspect. Then in March 1966, 9 months after the murder, the police made an arrest. They arrested 20-year-old aircraft worker and plumber named Harry Solberg. Solberg was a friend of the Thompsons. He and his father had installed the plumbing in their home. Solberg fit the description of the man seen at the Thompsons' house on the afternoon of the murder. He was 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, and he had blonde hair. Because of his physique, the police knew he was physically able to kill Dorothy and move her body. Also, at the time of the murder, he drove a black 1959 Ford. On March 13, 1966, Solberg went to the police station to take a polygraph exam. He went back the next night to take another polygraph exam. During this exam, he said he was at the Thompsons' house on the afternoon that Dorothy was killed. Solberg explained that he was in high school at the time. He said he went to their house because he wanted to get some advice from Dorothy about an economics paper he was writing. When he got there, he found the door ajar. He let himself in and he found a trail of blood on the floor. He followed the trail and he found Dorothy's body outside. He got freaked out and he ran to his car. He took off and then drove around in a daze. He then admitted that he wrote the letter. The interviewer continued to press Solberg. After a few hours, he said, "I guess I stabbed her and beat her." The interviewer kept asking questions, and it was clear that Solberg did not know anything specific about the crime scene. For example, he couldn't accurately describe the piggy bank or the sledgehammer. He said the sledgehammer was big when it was actually a small one. Despite the vagueness of his confession, Solberg was arrested and he was charged with first-degree murder. Solberg went to trial in September 1966. A handwriting analyst testified, and he said that Solberg's handwriting was similar to the handwriting in the letter. Solberg's lawyer said that Solberg wrote the letter to draw attention away from himself because he had the bad luck of being at the crime scene on the day of the murder. Solberg's lawyer pointed out that there was no physical evidence, like fingerprints, that connected him to the crime. He also argued that the confession was coerced and contained no specific details about the murder. Major Samuel Rome, who had been taken off the case, was still convinced that Agnes Thompson was the killer. He ended up testifying on Solberg's behalf. The trial ended in a hung jury. Solberg was scheduled to go to trial again in January 1967. But before the trial got started, the judge decided that Solberg's confession would be inadmissible. The judge would not allow the transcripts of the confession to be read aloud because Solberg had not been advised of his Miranda rights. Without his confession, the prosecutor did not have much of a case, so they decided not to go ahead with the murder trial. Instead, because he sent the letter, Solberg pleaded guilty to malicious threatening under the blackmail statute. He was sentenced to 1 to 10 years in prison. He was never again charged with Dorothy Thompson's murder. No one else has ever been charged with her murder, and the case remains unsolved. Some people believe that Dorothy's mother-in-law, Agnes Thompson, was the one who killed her. But other people don't believe she was mentally and physically able to do it. Other people think that Harry Solberg killed her and got away with it. While critics of that theory point out that everything he knew about the murder could have been found in the newspaper articles about the murder. They think he was just a victim of bad luck. Finally, there are people who believe that neither Agnes nor Solberg killed Dorothy. But as to who did is a mystery. Unfortunately, the murder of Dorothy Thompson will likely never be solved. Number 2. Paddy Moriarty. Larrimah is a small town in Australia's Northern Territory. It was home to only 12 people, and the average age of the residents was 70. In the town, there are two businesses. There's the Pink Panther Roadhouse, which is a combination of a bar, trailer park, and a small zoo, and then there is a cafe called Fran's Devonshire Tea House. Most people who visit Larimar just stop there while they are traveling north or south of the town. The area has a notorious reputation. Supposedly, Aboriginals do not live in the area because they believe it is haunted. Larimar is surrounded by thick brush, and there is only one road in and out of the town. Also, despite living in a small, isolated town in the middle of nowhere, many of the town's residents do not get along. One of the town's residents was Paddy Moriarty. Moriarty was born in Ireland, and he came to Australia when he was 18. In December 2017, Moriarty was 70 years old, and he lived with his beloved dog, Kelly. Moriarty was a laborer, and he frequented the Pink Panther Roadhouse. On Saturday, December 16th, he went to the bar and drank 8 beers, which wasn't too unusual for him. Sometime between 6 and 6:30 p.m., he walked out of the bar, got onto his quad bike, and he drove the 300 feet to his home. Every Sunday, several residents of the town gather at the Pink Panther to watch a television show called Landline, which covers rural issues. They call the weekly meeting church. When Moriarty didn't show up for church on December 17th, his friends became worried and they started looking for him. They went to his home, but he wasn't there, and neither was his dog. The police were called in, and they went to Moriarty's home. His car and his quad bike were parked outside. Inside his house, they found his cowboy hat. Moriarty rarely went anywhere without his hat. He wore a hat so often that many of the town's residents had no idea he was bald. In his microwave was some chicken that a tourist had given him on the day he was last seen. The police also found his eyeglasses and his wallet, which had $225 in it. There were no signs of a struggle in or around Moriarty's home. The police conducted massive air and land searches, but they did not find any trace of Moriarty or his dog. The police believe that Moriarty met with foul play, and they've been investigating his disappearance as a homicide. They think it's quite possible that one of the other 11 residents was responsible for his disappearance. 6 months after Paddy Moriarty disappeared, the coroner decided to hold a special inquest, and nearly all the residents of Larimar testified. Many of them have been considered suspects. One of the early suspects was Richard Simpson, who was working as the bartender at the Pink Panther on the night Moriarty went missing. He was one of the last people to see Moriarty alive. Simpson had a reputation for having a violent temper. Moriarty was a heavy drinker, and sometimes he'd get mean when he was drunk. People in the town speculated that Moriarty said or did something that made Simpson angry, so Simpson killed him. Simpson testified at the inquest. On the stand, Simpson denied having anything to do with Moriarty's disappearance. He said that someone at Fran's Devonshire Tea House was probably responsible for his disappearance. The tea house is run by 75-year-old Fran Hodges, who also lives on the property. The cafe is a popular spot for people traveling, and people in RVs often stop in for meat pies and scones. Moriarty lived across the road from the tea house. Moriarty and Hodges clashed constantly. Moriarty really did not like it when people parked their RVs on his property. He often advised the people not to eat the tea house's meat pies. He told people the pies would make them sick, and they were so bad that his dog wouldn't even eat them. When the Pink Panther Roadhouse started selling meat pies, Moriarty put up a sign in his yard proclaiming that they had the best meat pies in town. Moriarty even had an ugly nickname for Hodges. He called her the Bush Pig. It got to be so acrimonious between Moriarty and Hodges that a year before Moriarty went missing, Hodges tried to get an order of protection against him. It was ultimately not granted. Another resident of Lerma, who worked as a dishwasher at the tea house, testified at the inquest. She said that Hodges loathed Moriarty, and she often said that she wanted to kill him. There were even rumors around the town that Moriarty ended up in Hodges' meat pies. Hodges testified at the inquest, and she denied having anything to do with Moriarty's disappearance. She was asked if she ever said she wanted to kill Moriarty. She admitted she had. She testified that she probably said she wanted to kill him 1,000,000 times. She admitted that she and Moriarty did not get along. She testified that the last time they argued was 4 days before he went missing. She had accused him of placing a dead kangaroo near her home. This was not the first time he had supposedly put a dead kangaroo near her house. Hodges said that despite all this, she did not kill Moriarty. Hodges' home and property had been searched multiple times, but no trace of Moriarty was found. Hodges suggested another suspect, Owen Laurie. Laurie was 71 years old, and he worked as a gardener at the tea house. He was new to the town, and many of the residents did not know him well. What they did know was that he and Moriarty did not get along. 3 days before Moriarty went missing, he and Laurie got into an argument. Moriarty's dog, Kelly, was standing in the middle of the road, barking at Laurie. Laurie told Moriarty to shut up the dog, or he would shut the dog up himself. Before Laurie moved to town, Hodges thought that Moriarty and her ex-husband had sabotaged one of her gardens. One day, shortly before Moriarty went missing, Laurie was setting up a garden to replace it, and Hodges told him not to because Moriarty was just going to sabotage it again. Laurie supposedly said that if he did, Lerma would experience its first murder. Something the investigators noted is that Laurie liked to use his computer. On the evening of December 16th, which is the night Moriarty went missing, Laurie's computer got a virus. In Lerma, there is one payphone, and it's outside the tea house, across the road from Moriarty's home. On the night Moriarty vanished, 2 calls were made from the phone to an IT company. The first call was made at 6:30, and the second call was placed a minute later. Neither call was answered. The calls were made around the same time that Moriarty left the bar. Laurie testified at the inquest, and he admitted that he did have a bit of a temper, but he did not kill Moriarty. He said he was a 70-year-old man with lots of ailments, like high blood pressure, a heart condition, and osteoporosis. He said he didn't see Moriarty on the night he went missing. He thinks that someone from the Pink Panther killed him. There are rumors that Moriarty may have been killed by the Pink Panther, but not by a human. The owner of the Pink Panther, 76-year-old Barry Sharp, has a collection of exotic animals behind the roadhouse. One of the animals is a saltwater crocodile named Sneaky Sam. Some people believe that Sneaky Sam killed and ate Moriarty and Kelly. Another possibility is that whoever killed Moriarty fed his remains to the crocodile. But the police have found no evidence that Sneaky Sam was involved in Moriarty's disappearance. While there are plenty of rumors about who killed Paddy Moriarty, there is not much evidence to substantiate any of the theories. The police also have no idea what happened to his remains. It is as if a hole in reality opened up in the small town of Lerma, and Moriarty and his dog walked through it. The lead investigator on the case is convinced that Moriarty was murdered, and he has vowed to solve the case. Number 1. Maria Ridolph. Sycamore, Illinois is a small town less than 70 miles west of downtown Chicago. In 1957, the town had a population of just over 5,000 people. It was an idyllic and safe small town. No one locked their doors, and children played outside without much adult supervision. December 3, 1957 was a cold day in Sycamore. That evening, 7-year-old Maria Ridolph ate dinner with her mother, her father, her 2 sisters, and her brother. Maria was the youngest in her family. Late that afternoon, it had started to snow, and it was the first flurries of winter. After dinner, Maria's parents let her go outside to play with her friend, Kathy Sigmund. Maria and Kathy went to the closest intersection to play around a large elm tree. As they were playing, a young man with a narrow face and blonde hair that was combed into a ducktail approached them. He said his name was Johnny. He said he was 24 years old and he wasn't married. His voice was high and thin. The girls had never seen him before. He offered the girls a piggyback ride, and Maria accepted his offer. The man who called himself Johnny carried Maria on his back for about 20 feet, and then he dropped her off 3 houses down from her family's home. After Maria got off his back, she ran into her house and picked up a doll. She wanted to take the doll with her on her next piggyback ride. While Maria was inside, Kathy and the young man who called himself Johnny stood out on the sidewalk. Kathy asked the man what time it was, and he said it was 7 o'clock. When Maria came back outside, Kathy went into her home to pick up a pair of mittens. When Kathy came back outside, she couldn't find Maria or Johnny. Kathy went to Maria's house, and Maria's 11-year-old brother, Chuck, answered the door. Chuck told Kathy that Maria was outside playing. So Kathy went to look for her friend. But she couldn't find her, so she went back and told Chuck. Chuck went outside and started looking for Maria. He searched for several minutes, and then he went inside and told his parents that he couldn't find Maria. Maria's parents, Michael and Francis, began to search the neighborhood. The longer they searched, the more frantic they became. After about an hour of looking, and not finding any trace of Maria, they called the police. Unfortunately, the police couldn't find her either. Maria's kidnapping was big news across the country. The director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, read daily briefings on the investigation. President Dwight D. Eisenhower also followed the case. But for months, there were no significant updates. What investigators did find out was that earlier that day, a few blocks from where Maria was last seen, a strange man tried to talk to a pair of young girls. The girls were creeped out by the man, so they went into a restaurant to get away from him. They came back out, and the man was gone, but they found several photos of nude women lying on the sidewalk. Also, several times in the months leading up to Maria's disappearance, on the corner where Maria and Kathy were playing, someone had written obscenities in chalk on the stop sign and the elm tree. But it's unclear if any of these incidents were connected to Maria's disappearance. On April 26, 1952, about 5 months after Maria went missing, a farmer and his wife were looking for mushrooms in a field beside Highway 20, just outside of Stockton, Illinois, which is about 120 miles from Sycamore. They found the skeletonized remains of a little girl under a collapsed tree. The police were summoned, and the remains were collected. Dental records confirmed that they were the remains of 7-year-old Maria Ridolph. Because of the state of the remains, a cause of death could not be determined. She was only wearing a coat, shirt, undershirt, and socks. The rest of her clothes have never been found. The FBI originally worked on the case, but since it did not appear that Maria had been taken across state lines after her remains were found, the FBI handed the case over to the Illinois State Police, which is known by its acronym, the ISP. Between the FBI and the ISP, they had over 100 suspects, but it did not lead to any arrests. The case soon became colder than the night Maria disappeared. In October 1997, as the 40th anniversary of Maria's kidnapping approached, a lieutenant with the Sycamore Police Department named Patrick Solar announced that the case was closed. He said that Maria was most likely killed by a truck driver and carnival worker named William Henry Redmond. Solar said that he found Redmond through the FBI's offender database. Solar said that in 1988, Redmond had been convicted of killing 8-year-old Jane Elthoff. Jane was strangled to death in Trainer, Pennsylvania on April 25, 1951, 37 years before Redmond was charged with her murder. Jane's body was found in the front seat of a pickup truck on the grounds of a carnival. Jane's case had been cold, and then in October 1985, a detective reopened the case. He discovered that Redmond had been working at the carnival on the night Jane was murdered. Also, his thumbprint was found inside the pickup truck where Jane's body was found. In January 1988, the detective found out that Redmond was living in Grand Island, Nebraska. The detective interviewed Redmond, and the detective claimed that Redmond confessed to the murder of Jane. This led the detective to arrest Redmond for the murder of Jane Elthoff. Solar thought that Maria and Jane's murders were similar enough that they were most likely committed by the same person. Another reason Solar thought that Redmond killed Maria was because of the location of where her body had been dumped. Solar said that if Redmond drove from Sycamore to his home in Grand Island, it would have been fastest to drive down Highway 20, where Maria's remains were found. A newspaper in DeKalb County, where Sycamore is located, noted several problems with Solar's theory. The first is that Kathy Sigmund said the man who kidnapped Maria was in his 20s. When Maria was kidnapped, Redmond was 36 years old. Another problem is that Redmond was never convicted of killing Jane Althoff. He was arrested and charged with her murder, but he did not go to trial because there were a lot of problems with the case. Notably, the detective who investigated the murder refused to reveal the identity of an informant. The detective was ultimately held in contempt of court for not revealing the identity of the informant. Another problem was the confession. The detective interviewed Redmond for 14 hours, and the interview was not recorded. So there was no way to verify that Redmond confessed. Another problem was the thumbprint. It was found inside the truck, and it was not on Jane's body. That meant the thumbprint did not definitively tie him to the murder. It just meant that he was inside the truck at some point. The charges against Redmond were dismissed in early 1990. William Henry Redmond died in January 1992 at the age of 67 from emphysema. A third problem with Solar's theory about Redmond involves where Maria's body was dumped. Maria's body was found off of Highway 20. Solar said that if Redmond were driving from Sycamore to his home in Grand Island, the fastest way would have been to take Highway 20. But that is not the case. Interstate 80 and Highway 30 are more direct routes. Highway 20 is about 90 miles out of the way. Finally, there is no evidence that Redmond was in the state of Illinois on the day Maria was kidnapped. Nevertheless, many people in Sycamore accepted the theory. The idea that someone from out of town committed the murder was a bit of a comfort. They did not want to believe that one of their own was responsible for such a horrible crime. One person who was not entirely convinced that Redmond killed Maria was a woman named Janet Tessier. The Tessier family lived a block and a half from the Ridolphs. Janet was just a baby when Maria was kidnapped. About 4 years before the police announced the case was closed, her mother, Eileen, was dying from cancer. One day in early 1994, Eileen told Janet something that would haunt her. She said, "Those two girls and the one who disappeared, John did it. John did it, and you have to tell someone." Janet knew the John she was talking about was her older half-brother. She also knew that the girl who disappeared was Maria Ridolph. Janet thought it was possible that the morphine was messing with her mother's mind. But as she thought about it, she began to believe that it was a genuine deathbed confession. Her half-brother John was 17 years old when Maria went missing. He moved away from Sycamore 8 days after the kidnapping. Janet thought that he fit the description of the kidnapper. Something else that caught Janet's attention was that the kidnapper told the girls his name was Johnny, which is the name her brother went by. The more Janet thought about it, the more plausible it seemed that her half-brother killed Maria. When Janet was 21, she lived with her brother and helped him with his photography business. That's when she realized he had a violent temper. One time, he had threatened to murder her, and then he'd just tell everyone she ran away. Janet wasn't the only woman who had issues with John. John had been a police officer with the police department in Milton, Washington. The Milton police chief was aware of 5 incidents of John's inappropriate behavior with women. 3 of the incidents happened while he was on duty. John was eventually fired from the police department. Several times, John had teenage girls move in with him. He photographed some of these underage girls topless. They always moved out because John was too creepy. John had been married 3 times. He had at least 2 daughters. One day, when his daughter was 12, his wife found a photo taped to the bottom of a desk drawer. It was a recent photo of his daughter, and she was nude. Eileen Tessier died in January 1994, and a few years later, Janet decided to contact the authorities. Janet called the FBI and the ISP, but neither agency wanted to investigate her brother. One reason they may not have investigated John was because he had already been cleared as a suspect during the initial investigation. A few days after Maria went missing, the FBI received an anonymous phone call suggesting that they take a look at John. Many people in the neighborhood thought that John was a strange boy. The FBI did investigate John, and they learned that when Maria was kidnapped, John was not in Sycamore. On the morning of the kidnapping, he was in Chicago, undergoing a physical so he could join the Air Force. John said he left Chicago at around noon. He took the train to Rockford, Illinois, which is about 40 miles from Sycamore. At 6:57 p.m. that night, a collect call was made from Rockford to the Tessier's family home. The caller said that his name was John Tessier. John told the FBI that he was calling home for a ride. 2 recruiters at the Air Force recruiting office at Rockford remember talking to John that night. He came to their office sometime between 7:15 and 7:30, just after they had closed for the day. John said that his mother and stepfather picked him up in Rockford at around 8 p.m. It is believed that Maria was taken around 7 p.m., so it would have been impossible for John to have kidnapped her. Just to be sure, the FBI had John take a polygraph exam, and he passed. So he was officially cleared as a suspect. In the years after her mother's death, Janet tried several times to get the police to investigate her half-brother, but no one did. That was until September 2008, when Janet sent an email to the Illinois State Police. This time, her plea to investigate her half-brother caught the attention of a commander with the ISP. He assigned 2 investigators to the case. One of the first things they did was talk to another half-sister of John, Jean. Jean claimed that when she was in her early teens, John sexually abused her. He also forced her to watch as he sexually abused other girls in the neighborhood. The investigators then took a look at the timeline of the kidnapping. They thought that the main reason the initial investigators thought that Maria was kidnapped around 7 p.m. was because the kidnapper, the man who called himself Johnny, told Kathy it was 7 o'clock when she asked him what time it was. The police thought that the man who called himself Johnny may have lied to Kathy to create a different timetable. Other witnesses, like Kathy's mother, were sure that the girls went outside around 6 p.m. A man who lived in the neighborhood and knew the girls drove by the corner at 6:20 p.m. and he did not see anyone. A bus driver went by the corner at 6:30 p.m. and he did not see anyone either. The new investigators concluded that Maria must have been kidnapped sometime between 6 o'clock and 6:20. The investigators thought if that's the case, then John would have had enough time to kidnap Maria and driven to the outskirts of Rockford to make the collect call to establish an alibi. The problem was that John said he had taken the train from Chicago to Rockford and that his mother and stepfather picked him up in Rockford. He did all this because he was not driving his car. Without his car, he would not have been able to kidnap Maria and get to Rockford in time to make the collect call. Nevertheless, the investigators continued to dig into the case. They wanted to show Kathy Sigmund a photo lineup with John's photograph in it. The problem was that John had been expelled from school before the yearbook photos were taken in 1957. He had been expelled because he had pushed a teacher. So the police did not have a photograph of him from 1957. The investigators managed to track down the woman who was John's girlfriend at the time of the kidnapping. They asked her if she had a photo of John from around the time of the kidnapping. A few days later, she mailed them a photo from June 1957, which is about 6 months before the kidnapping. On the back of the photo, John wrote, "Love Johnny." The investigators thought that this was interesting because it verified that John used the name Johnny. When the investigators removed the photo from the cardboard frame, they found something that really interested them. It was a train ticket for Rockford to Chicago. Sycamore did not have passenger train service, so if people in Sycamore wanted to take the train, they had to travel to a nearby city like Rockford. Which is what John said he did on December 2nd, the day before the kidnapping. He claimed he got a ride to Rockford and then took the train to Chicago for his physical for the Air Force. He said he spent the night in Chicago and then he left at about noon on the train and made his way to Rockford. The investigators thought that the train ticket was interesting because the ticket had not been punched, which suggests John never used the ticket. The investigators concluded that John had not taken the train like he said he did. Instead, they thought he drove a car. They thought that if Maria was kidnapped at 6:20 and not 7 o'clock, it could have been possible that John kidnapped her. According to Google Maps, it takes about an hour and a half to drive from Chicago to Sycamore. If John did not take the train, what he did between noon when he said he left Chicago and 6:57 p.m. when he made the collect call is unaccounted for. Those 6 hours and 57 minutes that are unaccounted for would have given John plenty of time to drive from Chicago to Sycamore and kidnap Maria. According to Google Maps, it takes about 33 minutes to get from the scene of the kidnapping to the outskirts of Rockford. If Maria was kidnapped at 6:20 or earlier, John could have driven to the outskirts of Rockford and made the collect call. The investigators claimed that they did not find a record of exactly where the collect call was made. They said the only thing they knew for sure was that the call was made somewhere in Rockford, meaning the call could have come from the outskirts of the city. The investigators decided to examine John's alibi a bit more closely. John's mother, Eileen, told the FBI that he was home all night. This contradicted John's alibi because he was in Rockford. John also said that after he got home from Rockford, he went out with his girlfriend. and once again, his alibi was contradicted. When the investigators questioned her, she said she did not go out with John that night. Her parents were really disturbed by Maria's kidnapping, and they refused to let her leave the house that night. Also, John said that his mother and stepfather picked him up in Rockford. But one of John's half-sisters contradicted this. She said that on the evening of the kidnapping, her father, who was John's stepfather, had taken her to a 4-H social that went from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock. She remembered coming home to the police scouring the neighborhood. After talking to all the witnesses, the investigators thought that they had thoroughly dismantled John's alibi. Next, they showed Kathy Sigmund a photo lineup that included a photo of John from June 1957. The other 5 photos in the lineup all came from the Sycamore High School yearbook. So John's picture was slightly different. The background is darker and he isn't wearing a tie. Instead, his collar is open. After examining the photo lineup for several minutes, Kathy picked out John's photo and said he was the one who kidnapped Maria. The investigators decided it was time to talk to John. They found him living in Seattle, Washington. Not long after his mother died, he had changed his last name from Tessier to McCullough, which was his mother's maiden name, to honor her. In June 2011, John met with the investigators, and for 8 hours they interrogated him. He said that he remembered Maria. He said she was lovely, lovely, lovely. But he denied having anything to do with her murder. John agreed to take a polygraph exam. But when they asked him personal questions that weren't related to Maria's murder, like if he had sexually abused his half-sister, he became angry and refused to go on with the test. Not long afterward, John was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murdering Maria Ridulph. The investigators thought that the case would be a slam dunk if they could get DNA evidence. On July 27, 2011, Maria's body was exhumed. Because her body had been exposed to the elements 5 months before it was found, and since she had been buried for 54 years, no forensic evidence was found. A forensic anthropologist examined the remains, and she determined that Maria had most likely been stabbed to death. John McCullough went to trial in April 2012, but it wasn't for the murder of Maria Ridulph. It was for sexually abusing his half-sister, Jean. John was ultimately acquitted. His trial for the abduction and murder of Maria Ridulph began on September 10, 2012. The crimes happened nearly 55 years earlier. It was the coldest case to ever go to trial in the United States. John chose to be tried by a judge and not a jury. Absolutely no forensic evidence was presented at the trial. The trial lasted for 3 days, and John was found guilty of kidnapping and murder. In December 2012, John was sentenced to life in prison. John appealed his convictions. The kidnapping conviction was vacated because the statute of limitations had run out. In the autumn of 2015, DeKalb County's state attorney, Richard Smack, started an examination of the evidence in the case. This included reading about 4,500 pages of reports from the FBI and the police from the initial investigation. The reports were not allowed to be presented as evidence at John's trial because the judge considered them hearsay. After a 6-month review, Smack said that based on the evidence, he was certain that John was innocent and there was no way he could have kidnapped Maria. He said that the evidence showed that the collect call that John made on the night of the kidnapping was made from downtown Rockford. Even using the investigators' new timeline that said Maria had been kidnapped at around 6:20, John would have had to drive over 100 miles per hour in the snow to make the phone call. Speeding like that, in dangerous conditions, with a kidnapped girl in the car, just to establish an alibi, did not make any sense. Also, there is no evidence that Maria was kidnapped at 6:20 or earlier. But there is evidence that she had been kidnapped around 7 o'clock. For example, 2 people in the neighborhood heard a little girl scream at around 7 o'clock, which at the time Kathy Sigmund thought that the kidnapping happened. As a result of Schmack's investigation, in April 2016, about 3.5 years after John was convicted, his conviction for murder was vacated and the charges against him were dismissed, and he was released from prison. He has not been charged again in connection with the murder of Maria, and it is doubtful that he'll ever be charged again. Many people do not believe that John McCullough killed Maria Ridolph, but as to who really did kill her is a mystery. Unfortunately, after 6 decades, a lot of the evidence in the case has been lost or destroyed, so it is doubtful that we'll ever know who really killed 7-year-old Maria Ridolph. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please check out criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/criminallylisted. Well, that is all for today. Thanks again for watching.